Okay, this is video lecture number 1 on scientific research methods. So in your reading in the Monahan and Walker book, you saw that they start with a discussion about how scientists ask questions and why they ask the questions they do and in the way that they do. Overall, as we go through the class material on research methods and statistics, we're going to be looking at all of these. How scientists ask questions, how they might go about gathering the information or data they need to answer those questions. And then in the statistics unit, we'll see some basics involved in how to interpret the data that is gathered. Of course, Monahan and Walker are focused on the social sciences, but the general overview of research methods really applies to all types of scientific research. But looking for a minute at the social sciences in particular, it's an interesting area because social scientists have often been criticized for doing research related to the legal system that asks, in the legal system's opinion, that asks the wrong questions, or maybe that research that asks the right questions but in the wrong way. So for example, you see here on the slide, there was one actual study out there that used the amount of damages awarded as its dependent variable when doing a mock jury study, taking mock juries and having them view a simulated criminal trial. Now that sounds silly to us since we know there are no damages in criminal trials. So that study was sort of a bust. But how about the other example that's on this slide that's maybe less nonsensical to us, but still not that directly useful for the law? And that would be a mock jury study that asks subjects to watch a mock trial or read a vignette of a trial and then rate the guilt, say, of a criminal defendant on a scale of 1 to 10. How guilty on a scale of 1 to 10. Now, using a scale like this is often necessary from the scientist's point of view because dichotomous variables, right, such as guilty or not guilty, this or that, just the two variables, those will tend to give really weak statistical results for a scientist. But in a situation like this, what the law really might want to know is, well, at what point did jurors' perceptions of the guilt of the criminal defendant depicted in the vignette, at what point would the evidence push jurors from the not guilty category to the guilty category? And of course, reading the data in a scaled fashion isn't going to tell us that if we just have the jurors decide, I think on a scale of 1 to 10, this criminal defendant is guilty at about a 3. Now, a lot of the time, the reason that law and social science studies sometimes don't seem to have much relevance to the substantive law is that, in fact, researchers' primary interest is not in affecting the law or even offering solutions for problems in the law. Instead, sometimes researchers just want to test some aspect of a social science theory. For example, the one I'm showing on the slide here, if you wanted to test the effects of physical attractiveness on a person's life, right? So if a scientist wants to do that, perhaps the scientist looks around and says, oh, the law seems like a good place to test that. And a really interesting example of that would be ranking or measuring the physical attractiveness of criminal defendants to see if that affects trial outcomes. So a researcher might do a mock jury study using very attractive defendants and not so attractive defendants and keep all of the other variables the same to see what the outcome of the trials would be. And there actually have been a lot of studies done on attractiveness and mock criminal trials and even data collected on real criminal trials. And most of these studies have in fact shown that more attractive defendants have a better chance of acquittal. And they also receive lighter sentences if they're convicted, except when the crime itself would be helped by attractiveness, like the crime of swindling someone. Studies have shown that fraud type studies or a fraud type crime, uh, mock jurors have viewed attractiveness as being something that would actually help a criminal commit that crime. So those data don't hold true with those types of crimes. Now this gentleman here pictured on the slide, both on the left side here, this is his actual mugshot. On the right side, this is not a real Calvin Klein ad, it's actually a mock-up. But he is a real criminal defendant from Stockton, California, whose mugshot here went viral back in the summer of 2014, and it actually led to him getting a modeling contract and an agent while he was in jail. There have also been attractiveness studies, in fact, using civil law scenarios, not just criminal. And the one I'm thinking of here was a study using a mock civil sexual harassment suit, where researchers found that more attractive defendants in sexual harassment suits were less likely to be found liable for harassment than less attractive defendants. And the attractiveness of the purported victims of sexual harassment also affected the outcomes in those studies, with less attractive plaintiffs losing more often than more attractive plaintiffs. So now, these kinds of studies might be really great proxies for studying the advantages of physical attractiveness on someone's life, but they're really not going to have a direct impact on the law. You can't really control your client's physical attractiveness except around the margins, right? By making sure the client is well groomed, for example, when coming to court. I do have, though, on this slide, a different kind of physical appearance study that might affect the law a little bit more, and that is a study of outcomes of mock criminal trials with defendants wearing glasses versus not wearing glasses. So in one study, it was shown that wearing glasses was associated in mock jurors' minds with higher intelligence, and was also associated with more not guilty verdicts in mock trials with violent crime scenarios. So more not guilty verdicts in violent crime scenario mock trials. In contrast, though, defendants wearing glasses in white collar crime cases actually received more guilty verdicts, and the researchers there attributed that to mock jurors thinking that maybe more intelligent defendants were more likely to be successful at white collar crime and therefore guilty of the crime. Now, in terms of real world application, you certainly can imagine that defense attorneys might take these kinds of studies into account when helping defendants dress for trial, and even to go so far as to get eyeglasses for a criminal defendant to wear that don't have any actual correction in the glass. Even those studies might show very small differences related to wearing glasses. Okay, so overall then, while social science studies using non-realistic measures can be faulted for not being useful directly to the law, they might still provide some insights into the legal process. On the other hand, for this class, we're mostly interested in situations where science, in fact, got the legal question right, or studies something that does have a direct impact on the law. Okay, so from Monahan and Walker, we get the three components of asking questions in a way that is going to be most meaningful to a scientist. So first here, the question must make reference to some aspect of the empirical world, something we can observe with our senses. And we have to be creative here, because just because something isn't immediately apparent as something that can be empirically measured doesn't mean that it can't be. For example, let's say we wanted to measure people's satisfaction with a particular legal process, like mediation. Well, you probably can't directly study people's quote unquote satisfaction or people's sense of whether something was fair or not fair, because it would really be hard to operationally define satisfaction or define fair versus unfair in a way that you could be confident as a scientist that all of your study subjects had the same understanding of those words. But maybe you could look at people's ratings on a survey, for example, where they rate satisfaction or fairness about several different particular aspects of the mediation process, say on a 10-point scale. Now, that would give you much more information than simply forcing study subjects to choose between being globally satisfied or dissatisfied, or between the entire process being generally fair or not fair. All right, now looking at number 2 here, the second component underlying asking scientific questions is often trying to find an explanation of the cause of something you observe. So making a causal connection between things. Some social science examples might be, well, how about the question of whether pornography causes violence against women? Or does the death penalty deter violent crime or deter murder? Or one that we actually talked about in class, does playing violent video games make kids more likely to be violent? And of course, there are lots of examples in other arenas of science too. Tort law, for example, gives us a lot to look at here. In a suit revolving around smoking and lung cancer, for example, there are scientific questions that are going to arise both at the group level and at the individual level. And we're going to talk in class about these group level questions, which I like to call general causation questions. In the lung cancer context and smoking, the group level question might be, can smoking cause lung cancer? Now we're also going to be talking about the individual level questions, and I like to call those medical specific causation questions as opposed to general causation questions. Now specific causation questions are usually a lot tougher questions to answer, like did smoking cause this particular plaintiff's lung cancer? So again, lots of different ways to ask scientific questions that go to show cause. Okay, and the last one, the third component of asking scientific questions, is that the question to be answered has to involve measuring or categorizing something or quantifying something that is observed. So number 3 here, I think really is directly linked back up here to number 1, right? Because sometimes something is observed, but then a way has to be found to put that data into a form in which it can be interpreted statistically. So an example I like to talk about here, my daughter, who has her PhD in sociology with a focus on immigration issues, she did her master's thesis on second generation Mexican and other Latino immigrants, and she interviewed them about their educational goals and attainments and also about their job seeking strategies. So what she ended up with was hours and hours and hours of interviews that had to be then transcribed, and then she had to devise a system of coding those interviews to attach certain codes to certain responses to interview questions. That way, she was able to present her data in a quantitative way as well as a qualitative way. So here's one way I mean that the process has to be creative, especially in the social sciences. So remember, just because your data gathering happened in the form of interviewing doesn't mean you can't find a way to present those data quantitatively as well. Monahan and Walker also talk about the importance of distinguishing between empirical methods of science and other methods. For example, intuitionism, which I have as a category here on the slide. Now, this course is primarily concerned with empirical methods, but of course, to truly deal with the social science in particular, you have to appreciate the existence of the other kinds of methods. So the study of human behavior, for example, makes room for a so-called scientific approach that in fact doesn't involve systematic or empirical observation. After all, we are all humans, so to understand humans, we can simply look to ourselves and describe what we see. But these methods are not really using the scientific method in the conventional sense because that does require empirical data. So these kinds of observations that I'm talking about here would fall over here in the intuitionistic category. The psychology section of libraries and bookstores are full of these kinds of books, things like Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus and so on. But most of these are not based on any systematic data collection and instead are sometimes based on, well, what we think we know or on really vast generalizations and categorizations that stem mostly from the author's opinions. And it's unfortunately also true that some expert testimony that is allowed in court also would be most properly categorized over here as intuitive or intuitionistic. We're going to talk, for example, about a psychiatrist in an Arizona case who was allowed to testify that his patient had recovered previously buried memories without any scientific basis to back up that this phenomenon is even possible, the phenomenon of memory recovery. This psychiatrist just somehow knew these memories were real, and he was allowed to testify. Another example that we're going to see in class is testimony on the so-called battered woman syndrome, which is admitted at trial in many jurisdictions, often in fact mandated to be admitted by state legislatures, and they largely made those decisions for political reasons. But as we're going to see, the battered woman syndrome is not backed up by scientific research or data, but instead is just based on ideas that at first glance have intuitive appeal, but that in fact sometimes have some unintended consequences. On the other hand, there are some very well done and well designed research projects that are not strictly empirical in the social sciences, like a sophisticated ethnography, for example, in a field like sociology. And in an ethnography, a group of some kind is closely observed, and many attributes and phenomena are recorded and described in a very detailed way. Now, this kind of research is, by any definition, scientific, certainly contributes meaningfully to the understanding of the particular group studied, even though it is not directly empirical in the sense that something is being measured and quantified. But empirical social science does subscribe to a more detached study of human behavior, and in fact, it usually is thought of as explicitly modeling itself after the physical sciences and trying to study human beings with as little intrusion of personal beliefs as possible. Now, at first glance, we might think, well, if you can't control a variable and if you can't do a traditional laboratory type experiment, then we can't use empirical methods to study a phenomenon at all. For example, remember we talked about the fact that, of course, we can't randomly assign children to two groups and expose one group to violent video games and then throw them all in a fenced playground to see if they beat each other up. But you did see in the book that there are many different ways of studying things and collecting data, and what is needed is, again, that scientific creativity and working with what you have to design the best possible methodology. So when we talk about battered woman syndrome, we will talk about ways that the inventor of the syndrome, her name is Lenore Walker, could have made a much more scholarly effort to test her theory and gather more systematic data. And on the hard science side, there are also issues that are maybe hard for some of us to see how they can be studied empirically. Particle physics is one example that I like to use, where you can't directly see the things that you think might be there, like quarks or strings or the Higgs boson particle. But in fact, particle physicists can look for the things that should be detectable if in fact the quarks or strings are there. The last thing I want to talk about in this lecture is one of my favorite examples of research creativity, and that is the work of the brilliant biologist Edward O. Wilson, E.O. Wilson, who came up with a theory of island biogeography. Island biogeography. And his research is really a model for predicting how biodiversity develops and changes over time. So what Wilson actually did was he fumigated several entire islands in the Florida Keys with methyl bromide to wipe out all the arthropods that were at the very bottom of the food chain on these islands. So what he did is he essentially made all the species that had been on the island disappear, and then he carefully monitored which species returned and in what order they returned, and he paid very close attention to the differences in speed of return and speed of returning biodiversity in every island. And he looked especially at the speed of biodiversity as a function of how close each island was to the Florida mainland, and also, of course, looked at several other geographical details. Now, this was, of course, in the late 1960s. We might not now today allow someone to spray methyl bromide all over a bunch of islands, but it still nevertheless is a great example of creativity in testing something that some of us might think can't actually be manipulated and testing. So the last thing I want to mention is a very important thing to remember is that even when we are looking at a particular issue or problem that we'd like to bring science to bear in studying, no one study and no one type of methodology is probably going to be the be-all, end-all one that answers the question. We are going to want to come at a problem in as many possible ways as we can and then look for something that we're going to talk about later, which is convergent validity. Convergent validity. That's just a fancy way of saying we want to see similar results showing up with many different approaches and methods. Okay, that's the end of video lecture 1.